Now, this is the 250th anniversary of the opening of Clifton House, which was formed. The Belfast Charitable Society was formed by a statute of the old Irish Parliament in 1774, and that statute still applies to us here today, although it's been modified last in 1996, which set out the powers of the society in a modern form. But the original framework is still there, establishing the society, giving its very awkward old-fashioned title, President and Assistants of the Belfast Charitable Society, and establishing it as a charitable institution and vesting the property in the President and the Assistants. So that still applies. So 250 years have passed, and the essential function of the Charitable Society is addressing disadvantage, which we were doing in a very different setting in 1774, and I'm sure we'll hear something about conditions at that time when you hear about who the founding fathers were. The foundation was actually some years earlier, but it took them rather a long time to get the money together, to get the building built in 1774. It happened in 1752, as we will hear when a group gathered together. There were 19 of them. We've nearly replicated it today. We can call ourselves the original board almost. For present purposes and for those who are listening on Zoom, we've all been allocated a name of one of our founding fathers. I'm Margetson Saunders, who was then the sovereign, which was the mayor of Belfast at that time, and he chaired the first meeting at that time. We'll hear more about all of them in a moment. Well, we're still addressing the same issues that we did then, and the question which we're posing for ourselves in dealing with poverty and disadvantage today, I have on my script here, which says, what should Belfast Charitable Society or the current citizens of Belfast build in 2024 to meet the needs of the disadvantaged, as it did back in 1774, with plenty of needs with our cost of living today. We're very anxious to receive donations to all who are present and all who are listening. If you've got any wealthy friends, we would welcome their contribution, as well as your own, to what we have to do. And it goes towards our cost of living grant fund. And just one instance has been set out here, and that is that over the past 2 years, we have funded 12,200 school meals for children in North Belfast. As you know, they don't receive the funding at certain times of the year, and the scale of the issue may not be surprising to you, but it was, I find it surprisingly large numbers have to be catered for through this system, over 12,000. Now, we're trying to reach a new audience, new connections, meet new people, get new donors, and all of that is part of our outreach throughout this year. Now, this talk is going to be about our founding fathers, as was on the screen a moment ago. And I've said that they met together, 19 of them. They met in a pub in Belfast called the George Inn, I think named after the King, or one of the Georges anyway. I don't know when the pub was founded, but the society was founded in 1752, and it was at the top of North Street at that time. Now, it was obviously designed by the merchants of the town to alleviate the distress in the area at that period. And one of the biggest problems that they were facing was begging in the streets, because there were literally hundreds of beggars around the streets. And part of the role of the charitable society was to deal with these beggars, either by providing support for them if they needed it, but they had a very firm view in 1752 that if you were undeserving, that you didn't get any help. You were punished instead. So you'd be brought in here and made to work if you were able to, but if you couldn't work because you were aged or infirm, you were provided with help. And that was the way they did it at that time. Now, our speaker this evening is Aaron McIntyre, whom I know well, and he's a former archivist of this society, and he was here for many years, and he has studied the archives of this society as closely as anyone. And for those of you who wish to know, the archive contains the minutes of the first meeting in 1752 and lots of books of minutes ever since. And years of research time is available for anyone who wishes to try and catch up with Aaron and his researches through all these records of all these meetings, and fascinating historical information is available. Aaron has a bachelor's degree in archaeology from Queen's and a master's degree in museum studies from the University of Leicester. And he has a particular interest in the social history of the Georgian period in Belfast. And he's currently working as a research and policy officer. So I look forward to hearing what, and each of you will be anxious to know more about yourself today. And now ask Aaron to tell you all about yourselves. Aaron.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sir Ronnie. And sometimes I feel like I've been here since 1752. But no, you provided a really good sort of opening context to the foundation of the Belfast Charitable Society. And as Sir Ronnie mentioned, it's 272 years ago tonight that 19 men, mostly merchants, some burgesses or councillors, the mayor of the day, and also the local vicar gathered in a pub in Belfast. And you might wonder why they decided that they were going to set up a charitable society in a pub, but there were no public meeting spaces. I'm sure all good ideas start out in a pub on a Friday night. Unfortunately, it's not a Friday night, but I'm sure Sir Ronnie will take us to the pub after this, maybe for this small gathering. But on that evening, according to the weather reports, we know the Irish love their weather reports. It was a cool, dry evening in Belfast, and we'll have that replicated this evening. Thankfully, the rain has laid off for a bit. And the George Inn was down at the corner approximately of North Street and Royal Avenue. That area has changed over the years, but that's the rough area. So literally a stone's throw away from where we're sitting today. And they met with three purposes: to found a poorhouse, a hospital, and also a new church. Somewhere along the lines, they dropped the church because the Donegal family then come in and reassert their dominance within Belfast and build the original St. Anne's, and I'll show you a photograph of that later on. But as Sir Ronnie mentioned, the Belfast Charitable Society archives are held here in Clifton House, and within that we have the minute book of the first meeting, and right the way through, I think there are unbroken minutes from 1752 to the modern day, bar the 1798 period when this building was used as a barracks during the rebellion. But you'll see there the names of the men who attended. And when I was asked to do a talk on the founding fathers, I started thinking, what is a founding father? Were they there at the first meeting, or was it the people who drove the project forward in later years? Was it up until the poorhouse opened its doors? And what I decided to do was take it sort of small vignettes of the individuals, and you'll see you have a wee bio of some of them there, and we'll talk about them as we go through the presentation tonight. But I also am going to finish on something that I'm hoping that the Belfast Charitable Society will agree with, who I think the unofficial founding fathers were, and the people that really drove the Belfast Charitable Society and the Poorhouse project forward. But just to set a wee bit of context, most of you will be aware that the Donegal family were granted land in Belfast and also Donegal, where they get their name. Their family name was the Chichesters. They live on today in Chichester Street and similar areas named after them. But after 1708, in April that year, there was a fire in Belfast Castle. And this is a representation of what the area might have looked like in the 1600s. You see Belfast Castle on the left-hand side there. Quite an impressive building. Originally, it was a defensive castle, and then it morphed to being somewhat of a family residence, a seat for the Chichesters within Belfast. But an accidental fire destroyed the building in April 1708, and tragically, 3 of Lord Donegal's children three daughters lost their lives, Lady Jane, Lady Frances, and Lady Henrietta. And there were also two other fatalities. There was a servant who died of injury, and also the daughter of the Church of Ireland vicar. And after that, the Chichesters removed themselves. They became absentee landlords. They left an agent in Belfast to look after the running of the estates, and they sort of turned a blind eye. Belfast started to decay a bit. The site of the castle was left as a ruin for many, many years, and it wasn't until the mid-1700s. So we're talking about between 30 and 50 years later, that this site was actually started to be built on and developed. And most people will know Belfast today, where the market house is on the far left-hand side of the screen is roughly where Dunnes Stores is today. So that just places you within the town. But the Donegals had a duty to look after the poor within their own estate. But being absentee landlords, that really fell back on the churches and also the local populace. And you'll see, just for those on Zoom at the very back of the room, for those in the room, you can look to your left or right-hand side at the back here. We have the original PERS board, and it details the money that was donated to the poor of Belfast through voluntary subscriptions. These were just wealthy individuals, most of them who left money when they passed away. And at the top of the board, you'll see the name George McCartney, and we'll touch on him as we go through the presentation tonight. But the McCarthys were a huge family within Belfast, and they not only created this board, but one of George's descendants donated the board and the money to the Belfast Charitable Society in the 1760s. But moving on to provide a wee bit more context about why in 1752 did the merchants of Belfast and the councillors decide that they needed to do something in that particular period. And I know the image on the right-hand side is a drawing of a mum and two children from the 1840s when there was the potato blight. But there was a famine in the 1740s as well. There's been a series of famines right throughout Irish history. And in 1740 to 1741, there was what was known as the Great Frost or the Great Freeze, and field harvests led to starvation, and a number of deaths and food riots were recorded within Belfast. And there were blizzards, you name it, it was a very, very difficult time. And disease was also rampant in the town. You know, there's no sanitation, no piped water, or very little piped water unless you were wealthy. And in 1733, there'd actually been an outbreak of smallpox. And the image on the left-hand side of the slide shows what smallpox manifests itself like, the boils and marks on the skin. And then moving forward 10 years, within the 2 years of the Charitable Society being set up, there was another crisis. And this has been well researched by Raymond Gillespie. And he looked at the burial registers for Belfast. And in 1750 to 1751, you see a huge upsurge in the number of people who were being buried, particularly those of children. And he puts this down to a field harvest. And then the following year, 1751, there is another upsurge in deaths. And that he puts down to people being weakened, their immune systems being down, and then another field harvest, which just put an end to so many young lives. But interestingly, the minister, the Reverend Saurin, he stated this was God's providence. He was a Church of Ireland minister down at St. Anne's. And although he said it was God's providence ordained by a higher power, he stated it wasn't a time for speculation, because what he had witnessed in the town were merchants who were importing grain and selling it at a far elevated price because demand was so high. And he tried to put a stop to that. And Sir Ronnie mentioned that it was 1752, so within a year of the final crisis in Belfast, that the Charitable Society was founded. But unfortunately, they tried to run a lottery scheme, and the first one was a wee bit of a disaster. And it didn't bring in the funds that were needed. People didn't pay up, and it was basically fell to the men who were there at the founding meeting to do something. And they ultimately were commissioned as overseers of the poor. So they didn't rest in their laurels when the scheme didn't get sort of the start that they had wanted. They became overseers of the poor, and they were the ones who were administering the grants of emergency funding that was coming in, whether it was the poor's money or collections from the street. And I think it says a lot when we think of the Georgian period and these merchants. They were literally going round door to door into these unsanitary conditions to find those most in need and give them the money, making sure it had the most direct impact that it could have. But during this period in the mid-1750s, so 1755 to 1757, there's another upsurge in burials. Again, young children feature quite heavily, and there were grain riots in the town. The Joy's newsletter, the Belfast newsletter, most of you will be familiar with, they actually stated that there had to be an armed guard put on the market house, which I just showed you there on the left-hand side, to make sure that the grain was safe, because people were coming in, especially during the winter, to try and get this grain to feed their families. But during this period and further on in the 1760s, two men came to the fore, and I'll mention them later on, Henry and Robert Joy. Some of you know the Joy family who set up the Belfast newsletter, uncles to Mary Ann McCracken and Henry Joy McCracken. And they printed a pamphlet which stated that the poor needed to be looked after through the imposition of a local tax. So they were looking at different ways outside of the traditional relying on purely donations, that we need a tax, we need to get stable income, and we need to push that forward. And you can sort of see how this plays out in the creation of the Poor House here, setting up a subscription charity where people pay yearly and to become a member. They had voting rights, they sat in this room, and that ensured that, you know, this house and this building is still here 250 years later because of how they managed their money. But I want to move on to those individuals who were present at the inaugural meeting of the Belfast Charitable Society this day 272 years ago. And the first, and I thought it was only right to start with the man who was chairing the meeting, interesting gentleman, especially his first name, Margetson Saunders. And the Charitable Society, yes, it was a group of men who came together, but obviously there was one or two people who were the instigators of the scheme, and it's very difficult all these years later to see who exactly those men were that were driving this forward, who brought this band of 19 men together. But they were quite shrewd, and you'll see this as we go through the presentation, because they decided that they needed to bring the town corporation or the council on board. And who better than the sovereign or the mayor of the day, Margaret Saunderson. And he was long-standing in Belfast politics. You weren't elected the way we would go out today and vote. You were appointed by the Donegal family. So when one of the councillors passed away, the Donegal family in 1733 put Margetson in as their choice. And he held the role of sovereign or mayor on 3 occasions, and actually passed away a few years after being the chair of the meeting in 1754. So you'll see that as we go through the presentation, very few of those founding members, founding fathers, lived long enough to see the scheme brought into reality, because it was 22 years after the founding meeting that this building opened its doors. But Margetson was an interesting character in his own right, because he was not only a politician, but he was also a merchant. And in Belfast in this period, trade was quite seasonal. You would have had your butter, particularly in early spring into early autumn, and then late autumn into winter would have been the beef. So these merchants diversified, but in order to diversify what you were selling or what you were buying, you needed a good transport network. And Margetson really drove forward the idea of improving the Belfast docks. And he signed a petition highlighting the poor state of the docks in 1740. Even though he was a councillor, he was literally saying to the Donegal family and the people of Belfast, we need to do more if we want this town to thrive. And a number of other members of the Belfast Charitable Society signed this petition, including Valentine Jones, William Gregg, and Daniel Missenden and John Ross. So some of you might have those on your piece of paper, but they were pivotal. I can't say that word. I'll be haunted by the founding members for that. But this ultimately led to the creation of the Ballast Board, or as you'll know them today, the Harbour Commissioners, those that were put together to actually improve the docks and keep Belfast pushing forward as a mercantile centre. And you'll find this as you look at the history of the Belfast Charitable Society. The men who were involved at this early meeting were integral to the whole development of Belfast, the Ballast Board and the Harbour Commissioners, Chamber of Commerce. It all really started with the Belfast Charitable Society. But there was one issue that Markison faced, and that was the issue of the PERS money, and this the money that's recorded on the PERS board. And in 1752, so the same year that Markison was sitting at the pub in Belfast chairing the first meeting, somebody anonymously, and we don't quite know who it was, published a letter in the press, a pamphlet, and this stated that the PERS money was being misappropriated by the mayor, Markison, to create and pay for silver boxes, which were called freedom boxes. When, I'm sure you've heard today, people get freedom of the city, freedom of the town. They were presented with these silver boxes, and this anonymous writer said that Markison was plundering the PERS money to pay for this. So after the meeting, after the publication of this letter, he sets about starting a pamphlet war, and he goes to town publishing his own rebuttal of these claims. But to be honest, I don't know the truth of the matter. What we do know is over the years, a lot of the PERS money did go missing. It was given out by the sovereign to his friends and family as private loans, and a lot of it was never paid back. So there's a grain of truth to the allegations. Don't know if it was quite for silver boxes, but a lot of it did go missing. But sticking with the theme of councillors, George McCartney, he was probably one of the most influential men in Belfast. And before I talk about the George on screen, I'm going to talk about the George on the PERS board here. It does get quite confusing. I've had to sit and do family trees for the McCarthys, the McCartneys, trying to work out who is who. But the George McCartney on the top of the PERS board is an ancestor of the George who was there at the first meeting of the Charitable Society. And the original George McCartney came to Belfast from Scotland in 1649 and became one of, or the McCartneys became one of the most important economic drivers and also political powerhouses within the town of Belfast. They diversified their trade, as I mentioned, trying to push forward the development of the docks. We know that the McCartneys developed a quay. And you see on the screen on the left-hand side, this is a map of Belfast from 1715. And you'll see the quays there. You have Merchant's Quay, George's Quay. I want to say it's named after George McCartney. I don't know really if that's the case. It's probably more likely to be King George at that point. But you can see that the docks were right in the heart of the town. See the churchyard, sort of to the bottom left-hand quadrant. That's St. George's on High Street. So it gives you an idea of where the docks were coming right up into the town. And George McCartney, the original, as I'll call him, he was pivotal. I'm not going to say that word anymore. He was instrumental also in the development of Belfast as a flour milling centre. And he also set up the first sugar house down where Sugar House Entry is today behind the Northern Wig. And there will be mentions or references to the slave trade and enslaved people during the talk. We don't have that much time tonight to go into all the nuances of that, but I know the work that the Clifton House and Belfast Charitable Society have done to address that part of their history and also the legacies of slavery today. But one of the most important projects that George McCartney, the original, was involved in was connecting County Antrim and County Down. And some of you may be seeing this painting. It's in the National Museums up at the Ulster Museum. And it's the Long Arch Bridge. And it was constructed due to George having the ear of Lord Donegal and how he could connect the two parts of the Donegal's estate and also increase trade and commerce. And it's likely that the George McCartney who presented the PERS board to the Belfast Charitable Society to give the money to them as well to carry it forward, so it was a better custodian than the politicians. It's likely that that's the same man who was there at that inaugural meeting a few years later, or sorry, a few years before. And moving on, the Charitable Society not only brought the politicians on board, but they also needed somebody who had the ear of Lord Donegal. And the person who had that most within Belfast would have been the Church of Ireland vicar, the Reverend James Sorin. And I should stress at this point, the image on the right-hand side, unfortunately, isn't James himself. It is his son who has the same name. But hopefully the family resemblance is there. But the Reverend Sorin was the great-grandson of a French Huguenot who fled from France due to religious persecution, settled in London, and that's where the Reverend Sorin was born in 1719. And he married a lady called Jane Duff and came to Belfast to be the minister of the Shankill parish, which included the town of Belfast as it was then. And the Reverend Sorin really did a pivotal role in really driving forward the granting of the land that the Charitable Society built Clifton House on, because in this time period, the Donegals, they owned all of Belfast. They were taking out leases or giving out leases, and the predominantly Presbyterian board had a lot of work to do to win over Lord Donegal, and it was the Reverend Sorin that really helped to sort of open up that relationship between the two. But the Reverend Sorin had very typical views of the poor of the day. As I mentioned earlier, he's the man 10 years before the charity was set up, said that poverty was preordained, but you shouldn't exploit it for financial gain. But he stated in 1751 in his sermon, I just want to quote here, that there is a plain and visible subordination between men. Some are placed upon an eminence, invested with authority and power, commanding the servants and obedience of other people, though in a much lesser capacity and less station in life. But the rich still had a duty to relieve the poor, but not extinguish poverty. And that was his view going into setting up the Belfast Charitable Society. Now, the Reverend Sorin did live long enough to see the foundation stone for this building being laid in 1771. He was the minister who would have been given the service at that event. But he passed away 2 years before the doors opened here. So he didn't get to see the project going right the way through to fruition. But moving on from the sort of elite in society, the minister, or the clergy and the politicians, I want to focus on some of the merchants. And this is the family portrait of the Bateson family. And the patriarch of the family was a man called Thomas Bateson. And he had been born in Lancaster, and he inherited quite large properties there. And he decided that actually Lancaster wasn't going to be where he made his wealth. He sold off all his father's property that he had inherited and moved to Belfast. Now, this must have been son property, because he not only took a lease of land from Lord Donegal, but he also purchased large sections of the Salters estate in Macrofelt, and also he bought a lease for Mora Domain as well. So quite an interesting figure. He was a business partner of a man called Valentine Jones, and I'll touch on Valentine Jones as the next individual. And they were essentially bringing West Indian produce from the Caribbean to Belfast. They were selling hardwoods, wine, rum, and their bonded warehouse was down in Wine Cellar Entry. So if anybody's ever had a drink or a meal in White's Tavern, that was the bonded warehouse for the Bateson and Jones empire. So essentially that's where all their pricey liquids were stored and then shipped out from there. But Thomas, by 1760, had taken a lease on 250 acres of land up near Newton Breda, and he retired in 1785, and he built Orangefield House. Some of you maybe know the Orangefield area. That's built on his estate, so it was quite a large estate then. But I think the image here shows the wealth that could be generated by those who set up in Belfast in the mercantile trade. And these are 5 of the Bateson children. And what I think is quite interesting, this is actually painted at Orangefields. This is one of the only interior shots of the house that survive. And you'll see that the young girls, they are doing what was typical of young merchant daughters in that period. You'll see they've done a flower posy. They've got the piano in the background and holding the sheet music. Very demure and very feminine for that time period. And what's striking to me is the boys. So their father's involved with the West Indian trade, and the 3 boys are standing round the globe. And I don't know if those at the back can see what's depicted on the globe, but it's actually the continent of Africa is the main focus on it. So it's all these wee small details that give you an insight into the family. And it's difficult to see on just with zoom, but the picture to the left-hand side is actually a painting of Belfast Harbour, again tying back to where the family's money was coming from. There's a portrait of King George and Queen Caroline, again showing their political affinities. And when you zoom in on the picture on the right-hand side, showing off their wealth again, this is Orangefield House in a painting within Orangefield House. So again, just reflecting the family's wealth at that point. And you can see it was a substantial property. We're not talking a small townhouse being built. This is a country estate. 250 acres wasn't huge by the standards of the day, but it was a good sort of middle class venture. And sorry, just to finish up on the Bateson family. Thomas retires to Orangefield House, where he passes away. But what I found interesting was, although the Batesons couldn't find sort of continuing on with the Belfast Charitable Society after the patriarch, that doesn't mean that philanthropy stopped, because they turned their attention to Knockbreda, to the area that the family were living in. And during the famine of the 1840s, Thomas's grandson, Robert, was giving out beds and food to basically his tenants on his estate. So that philanthropy carried through the generations. And Bateson was one of the few who survived long enough to see the project complete. He was there at the founding meeting, the foundation stone being laid, and he passed away in 1791. So a good long life. I think he was about 70 years old when he passed. But moving on to one of my personal favourites, if you're allowed to have favourites of founding fathers, just because he's such an interesting character. This is Valentine Jones, Thomas Bateson's business partner, close friend. And I want to start out, some people in the room will know I'm from Lisburn. Valentine Jones was not born in Belfast. Any book that you read, he was born apparently in Belfast. I found his baptismal record in the Church of Ireland in Lisburn. So I'm reclaiming him back, even though he came to Belfast at a very young age. He got married when he was 15, or married for the first time when he was 15, and settled in Belfast itself. He moved away from the family home. But I enjoy doing genealogy, and I'm working on a project related to another member of the Jones family. And through different research, working with other academics, the likes of Jacqueline Howson, we've traced his line back to Wales, where his great-grandfather was a minister who came and preached at Seago, out near Portadown. And in 1641, during the Irish Rebellion, his great-grandfather had to flee to Lisburn, and that's where he found safety. So I think that's what started the family connection with Lisburn. But Valentine Jones, although he was from a merchant class, he had quite high connections. His two of his brother-in-laws were clerks to the Irish Houses of Parliament, particularly the House of Lords. And they were there in 1801 when the Act of Union was signed, and they signed themselves out of existence, both the House of Lords and the House of Commons. Valentine Jones' half-sister, Henrietta, was quite a militant Methodist, if such a thing can exist. But she was an early adopter of Methodism and paid for the chapel in Lisburn for the Methodist Church in the 1770s. And actually went on to host the Reverend Wesley when he came on his tour of this part of the island. So quite an interesting family by and large. But Jones himself, as I said, was a merchant of West Indian interests, and most of his family stayed in Lisburn whilst he moved to Belfast. Only one other brother emigrated, and that was his brother Edward, who then became Attorney General for North Carolina. So you're seeing the spread of these families, the connections, not just familial, but that connection to North Carolina opened up the Jones family going into those ports. Every transaction was beneficial monetarily and through friendship links. But as I mentioned earlier, the Valentine Jones dynasty, I'm taking this man as the first Valentine Jones because there's a number of them. I don't want to confuse everyone tonight, but take him as number one. He was importing rum, then later sugar, and his son Valentine moved out to Barbados. So Valentine number two moved out to Barbados and lived there for the next 34 years. He was involved with the running of the plantations and was part of the transatlantic slave network or slave triangle that was going on in this period. And on the right-hand side, this is actually Valentine Jones's signature from a document within the Belfast Charitable Society's collections. As you can see, quite a good hand. You'll see if you go through some of the older documents, there were a lot of the merchant class who, yes, had learned to read and write, but their writing, they're not confident in it. But you can see that Valentine Jones was very confident. But not only was he working to set up her house in the 1750s and continued on right the way through to his death, he was involved in setting up the Lagan navigation and putting money towards that alongside Lord Donegal. Again, it was opening up trade. If you could open up the Lagan Valley, you were able to bring the linen from Lisburn via the canal. It was all about forwarding the commerce of the area. And Valentine Jones had another son and daughter. I mentioned Valentine already, but he also had Ned and Margaret. And they lived basically as members of society, a gentleman and a gentlewoman. They had their own estates. They'd inherited money from Valentine Jones's father-in-law, and they decided to go off on a tour of France in the 1780s and got caught up in the French Revolution and witnessed firsthand the violence that's the fallout from that. They managed to get home to Ireland fairly quickly, but they set up down at Kilwalter Castle. Some of you know Kilwalter, just up from Larne. But moving on, and I don't want to focus too heavily on the Joneses, but they are one of the few families that we have a lot of detail around who they were, what their business interests were, and really who they were as people. But the third Valentine Jones I want to mention is this man's grandson. Is everybody clear on that? This Valentine was the son of Valentine number two. So he was born in Barbados, and he was involved in the American Revolutionary War on the revolutionary side, not the British side. So you can sort of see the loyalties change depending on what side of the Atlantic that you're on. And ultimately, he was involved in a bit of a fraud and embezzlement scandal, the equivalent of about £10 million today, 87,000 in the 1700s. And this came to a head, and he was imprisoned in Newgate for a number of years. And I want to quote from the report about him and this embezzlement that he was involved in. But my understanding of it is basically, if you take a barrel of rum, you take a bit of rum off the top, you dilute it down, you sort of take that going down through, and you come up with an awful lot more rum than you started off with, and he got caught. But the report states, just quote here, that such a mass of public corruption has never been equaled in the history of this country. And this case is still cited in the legal world, and Sir Ronnie might be able to enlighten me on that, as for this particular kind of conviction for fraud. So again, who knew that Belfast Charitable Society had somewhat distant connections to these individuals? But the middle class in Belfast really were quite a small, close-knit society. Some of you maybe heard of Dr. William Drennan. founder of the United Irishmen, involved with the poorhouse here, smallpox inoculations. But he tried to get the hand of Valentine Jones's daughter, Margaret, who had witnessed the French Revolution. And it wasn't Valentine that turned him down. He left it up to his daughter, and it was Margaret.
Oh.
She said that she felt that he was maybe potentially after her wealth, not her beauty. But she was apparently a very beautiful woman, according to the letters of the time. But Valentine Jones really became the patriarch of the family. He lived until he was 94, so he outlived all of his siblings who were resident in Ireland, and he really looked after his nieces and nephews, guided them in selling property, and gave off to them quite a bit for mismanaging their own finances. But he was blind in his older age and passed away in 1805 at the age of 94, as I said. But he's probably most famous for a dance that he did, and it's mentioned in a lot of the histories of Belfast. So at one point, himself, his son, grandson, and great-grandson all danced a quadrille, a Georgian dance, in one of the balls in Belfast. So 4 generations of the one family, all named Valentine Jones. And after his death, Dr. William Drennan didn't hold his daughter turning down his hand in marriage, because he said that the man was fondly remembered by all who knew him, and noted the old man's party trick of being able to twirl a small carafe of punch without spilling it. So that doesn't add to the grand narrative of the history of Belfast, but I think it gives you an idea of these people's personalities. We can look at names, we can look at dates, we can look at facts, but it's when you build up those sort of wee intricacies that it really shows what these people were like as individuals, without taking away from stuff that they were involved in as well, that we would look at as unethical today. But going back to what Sir Ronnie mentioned about the Belfast Charitable Society's archive, it has an amazing wealth of information. And when Valentine Jones passed away, he left a good amount of money to the poor of Belfast. He left £100 in 1805 to the poorhouse here. And we know that he left about £22 to the Fever Hospital. Unfortunately, we can't find his extant will, but those were published in the newspapers as charitable bequests. So we get a small insight into his charity even after he passed away. But going back to the archive, on the left-hand side of the screen is an inscription that the Belfast Charitable Society did, taken from a survey of the graveyard at Clifton Street behind us. And if it wasn't for them being so far-sighted, we wouldn't know what was on the Jones headstone, because this was taken in 1907, and the Jones headstone was destroyed in the 1970s when there was a lot of antisocial behaviour in the graveyard. So it's thanks to their work in preserving these transcriptions, and also roughly what the headstone was like. So you can see that it had a triangle at the top in memory of, and then the inscription. It wouldn't meet with standards today, but it's better to have something than nothing. And Valentine Jones is the only founding member of the Charitable Society to be buried in the Society's graveyard, because he was one of the longest lived, born in 1711 and died in 1805. Yes, and for some of, and I will apologise, whoever has Charles Hamilton as their individual, sorry Ken, Charles Hamilton has proved quite difficult to research. What we know about him, or what the records show, was that he was a Scottish merchant, and he came to Ireland to try and expand his business interests and his ventures. But unfortunately, he didn't meet with much success, unlike Thomas Bateson, who came here and made a fortune. Charles Hamilton passed away of typhus in 1759, leaving a widow and 3 children, basically destitute. Essentially, people who, if the poorhouse had been open at that point, probably would have been coming in here. But his widow decided to send her, and I hate this term, but most promising daughter, to her sister-in-law in Scotland. And this is Elizabeth Hamilton, pictured on the left-hand side. And Elizabeth went to live with her aunt, Mrs. Marshall, and she had witnessed David Manson's school when she was here in Belfast. And some of you maybe have heard of David Manson's school, but it was essentially a play school. He spared the rod. He encouraged sort of positive reinforcement. within his schoolroom. And although Charles Hamilton's business didn't do well, he still sent his children, including his daughters, to this co-educational school. So he was quite ahead of his time and very much involved with the New Light Presbyterian establishment within Belfast, especially with his Scottish roots. But his daughter grew up with her maternal aunt in Scotland and went on to become a very famous author. Her brother did translations and she also analysed some of his translation work. So a really, really important figure and somebody, if you haven't heard of before, I'm just able to give you a snippet tonight. I'd definitely go away and have a wee read about her online, and you might even purchase her book. It's available, or one of her books is available for free on the digital archives. But she, as I said, was influenced by David Manson, and she really took this to heart in how she viewed women's place within society. And she viewed that the domestic sphere was too crushing for women and that they deserved to have an education and basically to have some willpower over how they develop their lives. Now, this was within the context of Georgian society, so she did still see their role as maternal, but she thought that they should be able to go out and work and basically push forward for the rights of women. And she maintained her Belfast connections. She was a good friend of Martha McIntyre. Some of you maybe heard of her, some might have been at the talk that was done a few months ago now, about Martha McIntyre. But when Elizabeth came back, she went to McIntyre School for Girls, and McIntyre told her, "My little girls, do not gabble over the Testament only," i.e. the Bible, nor read with that difficulty which prevents pleasure in it. Basically saying that it's something a wee bit more exciting than just reading scripture. I keep up my number, and 4 of them read Fox and Pitt, the 2 main political figures of the day, the leader of the Tories and the leader of the Whigs. So again, driving forward the idea of female education and being able not only to read, but to understand the politics of the day. The book that I've highlighted, and there are a number of hers, this is The Cottagers of Glenburnie, published in 1808, and it's quite a celebrated book about Scottish manners and casts a critical eye on the hardships that are faced by, or were faced by, women in that time period. And what's quite interesting is she has 2 fictional people, Mr. Gurley and a Mrs. Manson, who go to the local schoolmaster and convince him to set up a play school and to spare the rod, and basically mimics what was happening in Belfast with David Manson. And Manson went on to teach the McCracken children, including Mary Ann. And when Elizabeth was writing about his influence on this book, she writes, "His extraordinary talents exercised in Belfast were in too limited a sphere to attract any attention that they deserved." She was saying that Belfast was too parochial to actually appreciate what David Manson was doing. She spent her later life in Edinburgh and died in England, and left a legacy of numerous publications. I have a list here. I'm not going to go into them all tonight, but definitely I'll go and have a read about her life. I believe that she may also be related to another founding member. There's a James Hamilton, who is on the founding members list. And although I haven't been able to find the connection because the Hamilton name is quite common, the fact that there were 2 Hamiltons together on that list, it seems likely that there might have been some family connection. But moving on, this isn't the same image that you saw of the Bateson children, even though it looks like it. It's the same artist. But this is Thomas Gregg, his wife and his family. And Thomas Gregg set up in North Street, just down the road from here, in the 1740s, selling all sorts, again, one of these diversified merchants, Spanish fruit, London porter, French wine. He also was involved in bleaching linen. You name it, these men had their fingers in that pie. And Thomas bought a small ship and renamed it the Gregg. So they were very much into promoting their own name, their own sense of importance, because they had rose up through society. You know, they weren't the landed gentry, they didn't have generational wealth, they had worked for the money that they had acquired. And Thomas Gregg was a business partner of Waddell Cunningham, most famous for trying to set up Belfast as a slave trading company. are with a slave trading company and put down by yet another member of the Belfast Charitable Society, Thomas McCabe. So again, you see the dichotomy. These people could work together to try and address disadvantage, but had different views when it came to the politics or the ethical or moral issues of their day. But Thomas Gregg and Waddell Cunningham actually owned plantations in the West Indies, and one was called Belfast and the other was called Hillsborough. And these plantations survived, from the records I've been able to find, until the 1920s and 30s. Although they weren't or didn't have enslaved people at that point, you can see these plantations and the legacy of them right the way through to the modern era. But these men were involved in all sorts of schemes. Thomas decided that he was going to try and mine for coal up in the north coast. And I'm not sure if he was involved with the scheme at Ballycastle, which some people might have heard of, but these were the type of ventures and the pioneering work that these men were doing. He supported the Lagan navigation, again, like Valentine Jones, to improve connectivity. But he also set up the Downshire Pottery, which was just across the Lagan on the County Down side, again, connected by the bridge that George Macartney had built. So you see all these connections and all these influences coming together. But this painting here is of him and his family. And it's nice that you have the full family unit. Unfortunately, this is the best quality that I can find online, but the painting dates from in and around the 1760s, very similar to Thomas Bateson's. But the Gregg household was actually attacked in 1798 during the rebellion. He was very much on the side of the Belfast yeomanry, and this painting was damaged by being chucked out a window. The family managed to keep or save it, and one of the sons went back to England, and it hung in North Cleat Hall in Cheshire, and it's still in the National Trust property today. So quite an interesting legacy. This one family went back to their roots in England to actually set up a business there instead of remaining in Belfast. And on the left-hand side, you'll see his mausoleum. One of three mausoleums up in Knockbreda Church of Ireland. And the other one is his business partner, Waddell Cunningham. And if you go up there, they're quite impressive. They were restored a few years ago by the Foley's Trust. But as far as I know, there are no direct descendants of either the Cunninghams or the Greggs in Belfast today. There are in England, though, for the Gregg side of the family. And I know that somebody definitely has William Stewart on the table. But William Stewart was one of the few founding fathers who were not resident in Belfast when the Charitable Society was set up. He lived at Wilmount and Ballydrain. He had two large estates that bordered each other. And if you know Lady Dixon Park today, that was one estate, and one of the houses on the other side of the road is now Malone Golf Club. So one of the houses still survives, and that's one of the houses taken, I think that's probably about the 1890s, 1900, but it shows you the house itself. But William was quite an entrepreneur. He was involved with ventures across Ulster, including the Newry flour mill, even though he was based on the Malone Road. And you might be wondering why he was involved with the Charitable Society in Belfast when he lived on, well, essentially at Drumbeg. But Belfast was the centre. You know, everything came out from Belfast. So he had the main route into Belfast, was also equidistant to Lisburn, to the linen markets. So he had the best of both worlds where he was. And the Belfast newsletter shows him selling all sorts, Bristol, Crown glass, Welsh slates, if you wanted to reslate your roof, and various kinds of trees as well from his estate at Drumbeg. So they had their fingers in all sorts of pies, as I've mentioned. But he was quite wealthy, and not only did he support the Charitable Society, the White Linen Hall on the bottom right-hand side, which would have stood where City Hall is today, he donated £300 to the building of that in the 1780s. So, you know, quite substantial sums of money in those days. William himself is commemorated in Drumbeg Church of Ireland. Some of you will know it, it sits up in the hill. The only part of the original church that's still there is the tower. The rest of the church was altered over the years. but he's commemorated in a wee plaque within the porch of that church. And moving on to our last few individuals, and these people have proved harder to research, which is why they're doing one slide for 3. But we have here a 2p token made by a man called James Adair, and he set up the first private bank in Belfast with Thomas Bateson, who we met earlier. And they were involved with Belfast Charitable Society's lottery schemes. And lo and behold, that one that he was involved in didn't work out either. So the first 2 didn't go well. There was another pamphlet war about the reasons why money went missing and what happened. But I'll leave that up to you to go and research in your own time. But the British Museum have this token in their collections, and it's actually from Ballymena. And through their research, they have placed the James Adair of the Belfast Bank, who was the founding member here, with premises in Ballymena. So you can see the outreach everywhere. And I quite like this wee token. I make good speed, and it's the Irish hair in the middle. And then on the right-hand side, we have 2 original tickets from 1753 from the original lottery scheme. And they're in the collections of the National Museum, or of the Ulster Museum. And just to zoom in on that. So you'll see some of the founding members had to co-sign the lottery tickets to try and keep some tabs on what tickets have been sold by who and where the money sat. And the one I've highlighted here is James Getty. He was the son of a minister from Scotland, and he became a merchant in Belfast. He left Scotland and was involved with a number of petitions for free trade for Ireland, and supported the American Revolution. You see some of the early members were quite radical in their own ways as well. And the other individual who signed one of these lottery tickets was Samuel Smith. And Samuel Smith was born in 1693. He was a leading Presbyterian in the Rosemary Street congregation, and he resided in High Street. And if you know High Street today in Belfast, his garden actually stretched the whole way to Ann Street. That was how undeveloped Belfast was at that point, until those garden plots were then sold off. And he died at the age of 67, again, living quite a long life in Belfast, and one of the key Presbyterian members of the society. And there are some individuals who have just proved a wee bit harder to research. But some people, if you know your Belfast history, will know the Black family. George Black here was a sovereign. He held the position of mayor on 5 occasions, and he was vice president of the Belfast Charitable Society. Some people will know him. His son was quite famous, infamous for his involvement in the slave triangle. And his letters have been published by an academic, and they're available to buy or view online. Fascinating insights. His son was described as impish, renowned for his meanness, and admirably feared for his crooked dealing. So a very pleasant Belfast man. But the Black family are probably known to most of you, even in passing, because Captain John McCracken, Mary Ann McCracken's father, worked for George Black. So that's where those connections come in. James Ross, again, was a merchant. He had businesses in Belfast, New York, and the West Indies. Again, he was actually a relative of Waddell Cunningham. So those family connections coming together. And the final 2 of the founding members I've talked about tonight are the 2 members of the Hyde family. Can't find any connection between the 2 of them. The family trees don't seem to come together within a few generations. But John Hyde was involved with setting up a second sugar house in Rosemary Street near the Presbyterian Church. And Samuel Hyde was originally from Lancaster, but settled in Belfast at what we now know today as Hyde Park. And he was involved with setting up the Belfast Chamber of Commerce, and died at his house in Castle Place. But his daughter, and this shows you how small Belfast society was, his daughter married Thomas Gregg. So you saw his daughter earlier on in the presentation. And to finish off, these are my unofficial founding fathers of the Belfast Charitable Society, because in my humble opinion, if it wasn't for the Joy family, in particular Robert Joy and Henry Joy, we wouldn't be sitting in this room today. Because I've mentioned that the two original lottery schemes failed. When the Joys came on board, they took over the third lottery scheme, sent messenger boys out to remind people of their debts to the society, basically tormented people until they give over their money, and that way the money was raised. They also worked with the likes of the Church of Ireland minister to get a land grant in 1768, when the Donegal family decided, actually, we will take a bit of interest in Belfast again, and they set about developing Donegal Street. And the Joy family see, well, actually, at the top of this new Donegal Street is this plot of land on the outskirts, and we will literally create a public building that will face down Donegal Street. So it all sort of came together at the right time, but it was driven by a number of people, but particularly the Joys. Robert Joy is quite famous in terms of the architecture of this building, changing, or the spire today was originally meant to be a dome. He didn't like that. He wanted the spire to show significance and to be able to be seen from around the area. So there's politics and everything, including architecture. And on the left-hand side of the screen, we have a minute in the newsletter, the Joy's family paper, of the laying of the foundation stone in the building that we're sitting in today. And on the right-hand side is Henry Joy Jr., who is the son of Robert Joy. And this miniature is in the collections of the National Museums of Ireland. And it was given by another member of the Belfast Charitable Society, Molly McNeil, who collected these miniatures to save them for posterity. And thanks to her, we have this image. And if it wasn't for the Joys, not only would we not have the money that built this building or the design of the building itself, but the Joy family go on right the way throughout the Charitable Society's history. They're here when it's the poorhouse. They see it through Henry Joy Jr., who was a wee bit more austere compared to the rest of the family, but sees it through the cholera pandemic, the Irish potato famine, right the way through the generations from poorhouse to old people's home. They're there. The last Joy recorded as being present in this room at a meeting of the Charitable Society was in the 1940s. So it was an unbroken lineage. So that's why I think they're not only the unofficial founding fathers, but they really carried or helped to push through what the Charitable Society became with the help of a number of other individuals throughout the years. And I want to quote from Mary Ann McCracken to finish off the individuals who were involved. And this refers to her uncle Robert Joy, the designer of the spire. My uncle Robert paid his last visit to the poorhouse when unable to walk in a sedan chair. It had been the constant want of him to promote the comfort of its inmates in every respect. So he's still coming up here essentially on his deathbed when he can no longer walk. So it just shows the determination. And I'm conscious that I went over on time a wee bit, but this image doesn't look like too much. But this is the earliest depiction of Clifton House from 1791. And so when you think about where we are, where the Charitable Society has come from, the poorhouse opened its doors on Christmas Eve 250 years ago. That was 22 years after the inaugural meeting and 3 years after the foundation stone was laid. And when it comes to the Joy family, everyone who's been involved has left their mark on this building. And if it wasn't for those individuals, those men in the early days and the women as we go through the history right the way to today, they're still influencing what the Charitable Society is doing. And I hope that this is sort of giving you a snapshot of that history and why we're here in this building 250 years later. And Clifton House and the Belfast Charitable Society, as Sir Ronnie had mentioned, continue to address disadvantage in the different ways that it presents itself today, whether that was during the COVID pandemic, helping out children who, especially due to educational disadvantage, didn't have the computers to be homeschooled, or as Sir Ronnie mentioned, the children who needed school meals at holiday times. You know, it's changing nature, but it's really addressing the needs that we have in the 21st century. So I know it's unusual to do a plug, but I would say if you can afford to, you can follow in the footsteps of people we've talked about today and the wider individuals, whether, philanthropy today and giving to charity. It's not about, people like William Stewart giving £300, which would be several thousands today. It's buying a key ring downstairs. It's subscribing to the charitable society, becoming a member, or buying a book to read more in the history. Every penny does support the work that the charitable society's been doing for 250 years in this building. So thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Aaron. That was splendid and brings to life the whole history of the thing when you look at it in terms of personalities and individuals. And the impression created is one of surprising wealth in the town. Of course, there was surprising poverty as well, which is why the poor house was here, but there was obviously great enterprise and wealth around at that time. But thank you very much for taking us on that journey through the lives of so many of those individuals. Now, would anyone like to ask Aaron a question about any of this? Anything more you want to know about yourselves? There, yes.
Can I ask, did you say that there was someone on the board in the 1940s, McCracken's? Joyce?
The Joys, yeah. William Bruce Rainey Joy. Yeah. The family, if people know Belfast history, so the Joys marry in with the Bruces, who were Presbyterian ministers, with the Rainey family as well. I think the Raineys were Robert Joy's wife, but yeah, they were still on the board here. And the Joy family grave is up in Clifton Street Cemetery, and the last name on the Joy headstone is actually not somebody who's buried there. The last member of the board had a daughter who served in the Wrens during the Second World War, and she was killed in action, and her body wasn't recovered, but her name's on the headstone.
Sorry, and anyone else like to ask anything? As I look, and if anyone online wants to ask a question, they can do that on the chat line if you wish. What I would like to ask, perhaps, Aaron, could you say something to everyone about what happened to the Donegals? Because you mentioned how the Chichester family or the Donegals had owned everything. So, and they're not here anymore. So what happened to them?
Gosh, what happened? There's a lot happened in the last few centuries, but the Donegals did give back to Belfast. So when they were redeveloping or developing Donegal Street, they built the Exchange, which is where the assembly rooms are today. It was then done up by Sir Charles Lanyon. They did give a lot back. In later years, they had a house or a townhouse down in and around where we would call City Hall today, Donegal Square. And the matriarch of the family, and I forget which individual it was, but she used to hold soirees and card games, and at Martha McTeer, William Drennan's sister, she writes about going to these events. Basically, the Marquess of Donegal always ran up debts. They lived way beyond their means. They were moving between different towns and cities to escape their creditors, and that's why they ended up back in Belfast with the townhouse. They then built Ormo House, which is where Ormo Park is today, but they expended so much money on it, couldn't afford the upkeep, and it was demolished. I can't remember the dates offhand, but within a few decades of it being built. I don't think it was around that long. The Chichesters then, I think, marry into the Shaftesbury family, and then you have Belfast Castle as a residence is built, and then it's given to the people by, I think it was Anthony Shaftesbury. And again, apologies, this isn't my normal area of expertise, but again, credit where credit's due. The Donegals were presidents of the Belfast Charitable Society. They did give money. One of the Donegals is mentioned on the board there, the Lady Dowager, giving money to the poor of Belfast. And the Shaftesburys were involved with Clifton House right up until, I think, the 1940s, 1950s as well, if not further. But then we get into issues over land ownership and Loch Ness and everything else, so I'll maybe leave that there.
Yes, well, there's a question from Alistair Adair, who's the current chair of the board. Well done, excellent presentation, but he wants you to say something, Aaron, about relations between Presbyterians and Anglicans in Belfast. You mentioned that the board were Presbyterians. Not always so, but you mentioned that.
Yeah, so the board has always been quite a diverse board, whether that was through people's businesses or backgrounds and religious beliefs. But again, and you'll see it if you go out or when you're leaving the hall tonight, I'm going down the stairs, the boards of the nations, again, have scripture at the top of them. So it was about doing what you could to help those who were more disadvantaged than you. And that was really the focus of the Charitable Society. You know, politics, by and large, doesn't really seem to have come into it. There was obviously the 1798 rebellion, and there were United Irishmen on the board. There were essentially pacifists who took no role, and there were others who were in the yeomanry. Regardless of those religious or political differences, it's always been a united front on what they want to do with what was then the Poor House, now Clifton House.
United Irishmen, they were mostly Presbyterian anyway, weren't they?
Yeah, there was.
Dr. Drennan and.
Yeah, there was.
And all those.
The majority of the majority of United Irishmen in Ulster were made up of Presbyterians. I wouldn't say the majority of Presbyterians were United Irishmen. I have to make sure I get that right. But yeah, so the Presbyterians on the board, this was, and this is my own personal opinion from reading the archives, this was their way of sort of having a stake within civil society. You know, when the Charitable Society was founded, and even when they opened their doors, Presbyterians were essentially second-class citizens. You know, their rights were limited under penal law, and Roman Catholics obviously suffered more heavily under the penal laws. But you know, if you weren't Church of Ireland, you did have some of your rights curtailed. So this was their way to not only give back, but also to show what Presbyterianism could do. But this was never a Presbyterian organisation. It just happened to be that a large proportion of the board were Presbyterian.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But the Charitable Society have been very shrewd right throughout their history. You know, you don't get 250 years old by only bringing in your friends and only working with people who you want to work with. You work with those who you see an advantage in dealing with, or opening up relationships, or developing certain areas, going back into the early history. The House of Industry opened in Belfast in 1809, and instead of seeing that as a rival to what they were doing here, the Belfast Charitable Society worked with them and said, right, okay, you look after that aspect, we'll do this, we'll do food, you've got the bathing facilities there. You know, it was a partnership working.
Were these people invited onto the board? You think someone like the Joys, you know, you think, why were they not on the board?
Yeah, so in terms of being invited onto the board, what the Charitable Society was an early, what they call subscription democracy. So it meant that anybody who could afford to pay £1 became a member, and you were able to put yourself forward for the board and get other people to vote for you, or you know, and do it that way. And what I find quite interesting, in 1774, when the Poor House is getting ready to open, there is one subscriber who's a woman, Mrs. Barbara Collier, and she would have had voting rights on who was going to be on the board and could have went for it herself. Now, we don't have the records of who did go for it or what votes they got, but the idea that, you know, the Charitable Society, it didn't matter who you were. If you could afford £1, you were a paid-up member with full rights. I think that reflects the Presbyterians' sort of second-class citizenship within the town, but actually we're going to be more equal.
Yes, Mrs. Collier of Mount Collier. But also the Joys were on the board, I think, because the early committees that were set up included the various Joys and so on. They had different committees doing different things at the time. And as to the spectrum of opinion on the 1798 rebellion, you got to read what Kenneth Dawson has to say in the book, which is available downstairs on those opinions. And if you don't want to read it, you could ask him because he's sitting behind you.
I think it's George Stewart. I think that's.
Charles Hamilton.
Sorry,
Charles Hamilton.
sorry.
And Niall McSperrin, thank you, Niall. He missed where the Greg painting is now. Can you remember, Aaron, where that was?
It's in Norcliffe Hall in Cheshire.
In Cheshire. And why is it there?
That's where Robert Hyde Gregg settled.
Yes. I'm going to have to call this to a close, and the Zoom people may have run out of time. But thank you all who have been listening to us. I'm going to wrap up now. Thanks again to Aaron for his remarks and the most interesting evening. Now, I want to say that Aaron has a little booklet here of about the founding members, and if people would like a copy, just pick one up here or pass them around, because it's a summary of who the founding members were and what you might like to learn about them. Now, can I just mention one or two other events which are being held? Because on Sunday, we have a Heritage Day, and you may have seen the brochure about it. Here it is, Sunday the 1st, 12 to 5, Heritage, and you can have fun and games on Sunday afternoon, and it's to promote the society. There'll be heritage and crafts and talks and lots of interesting music as well. If you'd like to come for a time during the afternoon, heritage skills galore and something of our history. The second thing I should mention is that we have our usual tours at the weekend. Fridays and Saturdays, 2 p.m. and 10 a.m. You can book in and have a tour of the house. Does this include the graveyard?
The house or the graveyard.
Or the graveyard.
Or the Mary Ann McCracken walk every third week.
Yeah. Okay, so you can, if you may know, the graveyard is behind us here, on the other side of the ring road. It used to be all part of the same site, but you can visit that as well. And that's Fridays at 2, Saturdays at 10 a.m. Now, donations. This year is part of our 250th anniversary. We're trying to promote donations, and there are little QR codes somewhere where you can make donations if you wish, or encourage others to make these donations. Yes, they're on your forms, evaluation forms. So if you'd like to do that. Now, there's something else here, and that is something that I've written myself, self-promotion. This is not for sale. You can have one of them. There are 3 copies here, and if you'd like to have one, if you haven't already seen it, there is a little bookmark here, and yes, and it's got the QR code as well. If you'd like to make a donation or give it to someone who will make a donation, keep the book and give them the bookmark to make their donation. Anyone who'd like one, please. There's 3 copies here if you'd like to take one of them with you, if you can. And then the last thing I have to mention is evaluations. And the added incentive for this is that everyone who fills in a form will be entered in a monthly draw and will win a £20 voucher, which you can cash in for anything to do with the charitable society. Thanks to everyone who joined us, if you're still there on Zoom, and thank you all for being here. I hope you'll look up our next talk and come to that as well. Thank you all.
Okay.